Welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social, democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm Hilary Salt.
And today we're joined by, I was going to say a very special guest. I think we always say that, but we're particularly excited to speak to Philip Cunliffe, who is a professor at the University College London. I don't know if you say the full thing, UCL.
You've also promoted me, Sebastian. Technically, I'm an associate professor.
But I won't know the difference, Philip. You can just pretend. Okay. Don't worry. And what is it you lecture on?
So I'm an associate professor in international relations in the Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL.
Wow, that's a fancy title.
That must be a very long business card.
But I don't have business cards. I think I should probably take them back up. They dropped out during lockdown.
They did.
I think I need to order some new, and then yes, it'll probably be a lot to fit in.
Yeah.
So we've got you on today really to talk about the book that you've just written, and the book is called The National Interest: Politics After Globalization. And tell us a little bit about it and when it's being released.
So here's the book. I've got some advanced copies of it. And it's due to be released on the 25th of July. So I guess your listeners and viewers will be able to buy it by the end of next week, end of July. The book has been, it came out of a long process of thinking, arguing and debating over the last 10 years or so, really. Because it is thinking about how nation states are re-emerging in the aftermath of the collapse of globalization and the politics of globalization, globalism. So in the book, I differentiate between the economic processes that we call globalization and the politics associated with that, which I call globalism. And the national interest is making the case that we need to urgently start thinking about acting as independent nation states given the new political order that confronts us. And the reason I've been thinking about it for a while is because being in the Britain's unique position in the world, that Britain had the honor of playing a precocious role in leading the first revolts, perhaps the only successful popular revolt against globalism with Brexit in 2016. So it's off the back of, I think it's a book which comes out of all of the politics and debates associated with Brexit. So in some ways, I think the insights that are in the book could only come from being in the position of having gone through some of the processes that we've gone through in Britain. So that perhaps Britain is in a unique position that it has the possibility to take advantage of the breakdown of globalism and the reorganization of the world economy in a way that few other countries do. And so far, we failed really to take advantage of those changes. And I think that's very obvious in the response of our governing classes. I think, to link it to something that's very current at the moment, there's the Afghan relocation scheme, the covert Afghan relocation scheme that has just blown up over the last 48 hours or so, the ARR. And although quite a few of the details of that are still murky, one thing that strikes me about it that seems very clear is the extraordinary effort that the British elite put into defending the needs of tens of thousands of people abroad, even though they knew full well that it was going to cause public fury and discontent from within their own citizens, by embarking on this tremendously ambitious and costly project to resettle people whose connections to Britain are very obscure and still haven't been kind of fully detailed or elaborated or defended really publicly. And what that, and bearing in mind, so these are people, Afghans, who were associated in some way with the NATO occupation of Afghanistan over the 20-year period from 2001 to 2021. And what's amazing to me in this instance, or what the AAR demonstrates, is that the British political elite has put billions of pounds, perhaps as much as 7 to 8 billion pounds, in order to defend the interests of tens of thousands of foreign nationals at the expense of and hiding this from the British public. And what that speaks to, I think, is a globalist political elite. It's an elite that values its international partnerships, its international alliances, its international commitments over any obligation that it feels to its own people, that it didn't even seek to kind of explicitly or publicly defend or justify what they were doing, but had to cover it up with a super injunction, which this kind of historically unprecedented super injunction with tremendously kind of far-reaching consequences. So the ARR illustrates the dynamics that I think are at play, which is that we live in a world in which globalism is crumbling, but we don't have political elites that seem to be capable of navigating in that world in the national interest. Instead, they prioritize their international commitments at the expense of the commitments that they owe to their electors, to their voters, to their constituents, the citizens of nation states that they're elected to represent.
Just because I think it might help people to kind of get hold of the where you're coming from. Just to go back a little bit, because one of the things I thought was really helpful in your introduction was you explained that both the left and the right, for different reasons, kind of lost their faith in the nation state.
Yeah.
And that's why they turned to kind of global type supranational organisations. Do you want to just maybe lay out that idea of why both the left and the right lost their faith in the nation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad you brought it up, Hilary, because it's a tremendously important part of the argument and also of understanding, I think, the challenges that we confront at the moment, that there was a bipartisan consensus in favor of globalization and globalism. So for business elites, for the pro-market right, for the business class, more broadly conceived, for large swathes of the middle classes, globalization was seen as something which would be part of economic growth. It would accelerate international connectivity. It would be good for economic prosperity. And so the nation state had to be broken apart for that reason. You had to break down the kind of the national orientation of economies, promote international integration, seek global opportunities, court international investment, and everything had to be organized around meeting the needs of the global economy rather than making sure that national needs were met. The global had to be prioritized, and it was a matter of adapting to it. So that was on the right wing, the kind of the right of the political spectrum. On the left wing side of the political spectrum, though they were, famously kind of they're less convinced about globalization as an engine of prosperity. Nonetheless, the defeats that the left endured over the course of the 20th century meant that they were also disenchanted with the nation state as well as a political model. And that came to be seen particularly by the intelligentsia and left-leaning liberal middle classes. They came to see the nation state as a bastion of xenophobia, hostility, inward-looking parochialism, resentful kind of poor people who pressed their demands on the state at the expense of all of these other kind of important commitments to human rights, to global environmental challenges, to refugees, that had to be prioritized over and above the needs of the citizens of the state. And so you had this convergence between left and right, that globalism, the politics of globalization was the only option, and that required suppressing the needs of the nation and integrating into supranational structures. And it's important because it's crucial to realize, I think, that the challenges we confront aren't going to be solved by taking a right-wing approach from the right of the last 30 years or a left-wing approach. It has to be about defending the interests of the nation as such, over and above the partisan politicking of left and right parties.
So before we get specifically into the national interest, could you sort of distinguish between globalism and globalization? Because they're very strongly linked, but there's a difference.
Yeah. So globalization, there are many ways that people talk and describe it, but one of the most standard ways is to talk about the growing intensity of trade within international economies and the growing proportion of global trade as a proportion of overall global economic growth. And so over the last 40 years or so, up until 2008 and up until lockdown, depending on how you measure these various global trade flows and global economic developments, you had global trade expanding as a proportion of the global economy and also being a crucial driver of global economic growth. And, you know, a significant one. And that I think people understood that to the extent that, you know, part of the reason inflation was low for so long is because we were importing so many cheap white goods from East Asia. So fridges, TVs, microwaves, iPhones as well, obviously. And so that kept inflation under control and also disguised the fact of stagnating incomes, particularly for working and middle class people across the Western world. Because you're importing all of these goods, you didn't, and you could buy them on credit. Also, the expansion of credit was part of this era. And so people didn't, I think the precarity was felt by many people, the fact that they were dependent on credit rather than on increases in their wages. But nonetheless, there was a feeling, general feeling of enhanced global prosperity. So that's globalization. And it begins to tail off depending on how you measure it, maybe between 1979 to the early 2020s. That period of the global economy seems to be over. And certainly since the launch of Donald Trump's so-called Liberation Day with his trade war on the world, that has put a definitive end to that era of the global economy because instead of he's trying to reshape trade flows to the advantage of the American economy specifically, rather than letting the American state reorganize the global economy as a whole. He's prioritizing with the notion of America first. He's prioritizing the interests of the American nation, which is which obviously is his democratic mandate, and that's what he was elected to do with the program of America First. So the politics of globalism was the superstructure kind of built on top of that global economic model, and that's to say growing prominence of international courts like the International Criminal Court, the European Court of Justice, people seeking their individual where individual rights are taken out of the nation state and implanted at supranational structures, so above national assemblies or national courts, they're kind of elevated to a higher level. You had the spread of ideas of human rights at the expense of, say, civil rights or domestic rights. And you also had the development, the cultivation of political loyalties that went above the nation state as well. The most obvious one in our context, obviously, being the European Union. But you also have many other examples of that around the world as well. So you had a supranational politics of globalism to complement the model of economic globalization.
Okay, so let's sort of dive into the national interest. So at the very start of the book, in the introduction, you say that the argument of this book is that we should replace the political, legal, and infrastructural legacy of hyperglobalization or globalism with a new international order based around the national interests of individual nation states. So I think the national interest, people know kind of what that means in some sort of sense, but could you maybe define it, because we might be working on different definitions?
Yeah. So I think people intuit that they intuit what the national interest is by its absence, I think. Because people, I think, have a very keen, ordinary voters, ordinary people, perhaps people who aren't concerned with politics in their day-to-day lives. They intuit that the political priorities of our governing elites at the moment are not oriented around the nation. I think people understand that very well, and their intuition is correct, as illustrated by many examples, but most, recently, as I mentioned, the Afghan relocation scheme. So in that context, the national interest, what I want to put forward as the national interest is that it is not necessarily any kind of specific policy. There are many policies that would fit within the national interest. Rather, it is the framework through which politics needs to be done and thought about. So what we offer, what should be understood as the national interest, isn't so much like a specific list of policies, but rather the vehicle for delivering policies, which is to say, public policies that are built around meeting the interests of the nation. what the nation needs, what the nation aspires to, whatever is needed to defend the nation, whether that be foreign policy, military, infrastructure, economic, legal, whatever that might be. That is the way in which we submit any public policy proposal to the test of whether or not it meets the national interest, rather than whether or not it meets an international commitment for climate change, whether it meets the needs of global refugees, whether it meets the needs of some international treaty system, whether it meets our obligations to our international partners, whatever it might be. Those all need to be deprioritized, if not indeed completely thrown out. And the first priority needs to be what meets our needs as a nation.
It's interesting that you the way you framed that was that people intuit what is not in the national interest, which, forgive me, that's perhaps an academic way of saying it, but I think when we talk to people on the streets, the kind of words that come up all the time are, it's common sense that net zero is a daft idea. And that kind of idea of being radically full of common sense is something that I think we try to use as a test ourselves. Maybe we need to frame that in terms of what's in the national interest.
Yeah, it's a point I've made is, you think, so Keir Starmer, gradually we hear kind of our rulers, our leaders kind of talking in terms of the national interest. They're kind of fumbling with the language. But every time they mouth it and say it, it kind of only invites further skepticism, because why would you need to say it? Obviously, it's common sense that a leader elected of a particular country should be acting on behalf of the national interest. So when you start saying, Starmer says something like, I will make my decision on the basis of the national interest. Well, what other possible basis would you make the decision on, given that you're the prime minister? So, I think it is a common sense politics. The national interest should be a common sense politics, but it's not been for 40 years.
Agreed.
Which is extraordinary. The common sense has been human rights. It's been global climate change. It's been fighting global wars for democracy. It's been prioritizing international integration. That has been quite literally the common sense, at least of international elites. And so it is a common sense. I think the national interest would be a common sense that is much closer to the street. Yep. And that seems to me its strength.
Okay, I want to throw out some challenges from people that I'm sure might be listening and thinking that sounds very selfish, sounds very nationalistic.
Parochial.
That represents a bygone era, and we're moving into a much fairer world of international cooperation. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, so that certainly would have been the argument made against the national interest for many years, over the last 40 years. It's backward looking, it's parochial, it's inward, for a world that's dynamic, expanding, prosperous, and there's so many kind of future horizons if you're willing to leave behind your community, your town, your nation, your patriotism, if you're just willing to be more open-minded, more open to everything that the world offers, you can leave those kinds of ideas behind. And I never found that convincing, I have to say. But I would say just much more solidly that that world that was promised to us through globalization, that in fact is the world of the past now. That's the world that has gone. The world of where international integration was always the solution to any problem is broken up by new geopolitical rivalries, mainly between Russia, America, and China. That you have a fragmenting world economy, which is becoming much more heavily regionally based. And in that context, it's incumbent on people to start thinking in terms of what is in the national interest. And far from being selfish, I think it's the only meaningful way to do democratic politics. Because at the core of the idea of the national interest is the idea of leaders acting on our behalf, acting in our interests, and it gives us a standard by which we hold them to account. Have you acted in our interest or not? So if we don't have, this would have always been my response, even during the high point of globalization, if we don't have a national interest, then we don't have any political representation to speak of. So the national interest is core to any meaningful notion of representative politics. And without it, then we are truly lost. So it's that would be my response to the idea that it's simply kind of backward and parochial.
I think you quoted, is it George Kennan, the American strategist, who said something along the lines of, actually, it's kind of hubristic to imagine that you know what's in the best interests of the whole world. And actually, we can only really know and understand our own national interests.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was the criticism made, like you say, this is one criticism made by George Kennan, who's this renowned Cold War era strategist. And he inverted that argument. He said, so when he was challenged about the national interest being parochial or limited, he said it's the other way around, to imagine that you could speak for the whole world when you only kind of come from one part of it, you only live in one part of it, you only represent one part of it, would be an act of tremendous hubris. And in fact, it's an empty kind of idealistic mirage. And so I think there is a humility to the national interest that is warranted and welcome after decades of policies that have been crafted on behalf of the world by people who are not elected by the world, who don't stand for the world, but who claim to. And so that humility, I think, that's also embedded in the national interest is something that should be welcomed by everyone.
Do you want to continue with your challenges?
I'm just going to keep throwing challenges
Sebastian,
out.
yeah.
I hope that's
Please do,
okay,
yeah.
Philip. Yeah. So I wanted to get onto this idea of mutuality between countries, and particularly I'm thinking of all my questions when reading, particularly your previous book, Taking Control, with Peter Ramsey, George Horne, Lee Jones, I think.
Yeah.
And also with this book, which things like, and I think I am a softie at heart. So I think of things like if another country was going through a famine or was attacked by a neighbour, what if it was not in our national interest, or didn't seem to be in our national interest? Should we just leave them to it and allow people to die?
Yeah, so it's always this has always been the kind of the hard test case, and I can assure you it's the kind of debates that happen in seminar rooms up and down the country. For 30, 20 years, this is always the kind of the case of the humanitarian intervention. You have a terrible crisis somewhere, and it is incumbent on us to involve ourselves and to intervene in it. And I think it's a case of it's the national interest. If we're to have a response which is based on democratically legitimate response, then it has to be based in the national interest. And there is no way around that, I don't think. So what I'm suggesting is that instead of cooperative solutions on the basis of supranational arrangements, commitments that are entirely kind of rooted through the United Nations or the European Union or NATO, or just loyalty to the American alliance, the Western alliance, we need to reorganize our thinking and our responses around the idea of the national interest, and that it will be a more solid long-term basis for meeting challenges such as those international challenges elsewhere, precisely because it will be democratically legitimate. So people are skeptical about development aid and foreign aid, understandably, because 40 years of seeming all these resources being expended without any kind of seeming meaningful success. Wars for human rights, these kinds of entire kind of forever wars have been justified over the last 20 to 30 years on the basis of altruism, of defending women's rights in Afghanistan, of spreading democracy in the Middle East, of defending the human rights of these beleaguered populations. And in almost all instances, the military interventions made things worse than better, more chaotic, more destructive, more damaging. And I think partly the reason those wars lasted for so long was precisely because they didn't have a national interest at their core, because it was so unclear as to why we were there, what we were doing. The wars themselves became aimless and they became adrift, and it just became a military machine that was operating of its own accord, which always found new reasons for why we needed to stay. If we take Afghanistan, we've already mentioned it, that was the so-called forever war, a 20-year war, the longest war America's ever fought. We were there for all of it. for reasons that were unclear, kind of apart from loyalty to the Americans, kind of the reasons for being there were never constantly shifted. Osama bin Laden died, but we were there for another 10 years after Osama bin Laden was killed in the neighboring country, Pakistan, not even in Afghanistan. It became this kind of endless nation building effort where you are constantly adding new tasks and roles. And that speaks to military intervention without a national interest. So, to be clear, I'm not saying certainly the argument of a national interest is not to say isolation or withdrawal from the world, quite the opposite. It's to lay the grounds for a new kinds of international collaboration, and one that will be, my hope, my intent is, it will be more secure because it's more democratically legitimate and more contained. So we will know what we're doing and why we're doing it if we involve ourselves in any such kind of endeavors in future. And that seems to be a much better basis on which to confront such challenges rather than committing in advance to these empty kind of idealist abstractions which have no real meaningful connection to the people of a particular country, in this case, Britain.
And I think you've framed that in terms of wars, but I think you can also frame similar arguments if you're talking about humanitarian aid. So, I think there's probably room for kind of very immediate aid in the event of a disaster, a flood or something like that. But I think the kind of forever humanitarian aid that just makes other countries dependent on the West is perhaps not good for either us or them. But it makes people feel better. But I think it often isn't in our national interest, and it also often isn't in the national interest of the countries that we're purporting to help.
And I tell me if this is a fair representation, but to some extent you're saying, you can believe in these things. You can believe in humanitarian aid, or you can even believe in intervention, but you must justify it on the grounds of national interest.
Yeah. So, the arguments for military intervention were made in terms of duties, the responsibility to protect human rights rather than, say, national interest. So, I can think there are many military interventions that I can think of historic ones, which I think you could say, on balance, they were, the right thing to do, or they were legitimate, or whatever. But my argument is that we should certainly not have a world that's configured around fighting forever wars for human rights. And the way to avoid that world is to have a world in which is organized around the national interest. And so whatever policy one might propose, it has to be justified in terms of the national interest. And that seems to me to set a better and a higher bar for the exercise, for the use of force. It'll make it more coherent, more strategic, but it will also mean that it's disciplined by the democratic will of the people on whose behalf it's being exercised. Because if you say, this is in our national interest, this is why we're there, that gives voters a yardstick by which to gauge progress and to meet, to say, well, how far does this meet our interests? It's a way to make policy more legitimate, particularly foreign policy in the instance that we're talking about. But my arguments about the national interest reach much further than foreign policy and defense policy, because I think I can't in fact think of any public policy that we could talk about that wouldn't benefit from being subjected to the test of how far it meets the national interest. Whether that's school reform, academic freedom, infrastructure, public spending, economic reform, legislation on the internet, whatever it might be. It seems to me that almost all of our public policies the debate would be improved by submitting it to the test of whether it meets the national interest.
And the two things there, I think, one is that what that does is to almost demand a space for public discussion of that, which, there's hardly any public discussion of policy these days, is there? I guess many of us who have an interest in politics are very frustrated by some of the kind of mainstream media questioning of politicians, which never seems to get to these nitty-gritty arguments, and certainly encouraging a much more popular debate around those things seems to be a good thing to hang it on. The other thing is, that I guess, if you were like us, trying to put together a manifesto for the next general election, this feels like something that could be the bedrock on which you write a manifesto. It does feel to me that takes almost a reinvention of language in some ways. So, almost all the words that we use, that are used in the public about things that are in the national interest, are kind of boo words, like jingoism and patriotism and, all those kind of things just don't seem to have any kind of popular legitimacy, or
Yeah.
at least the elites think they don't.
Yeah.
And how do we kind of reinvent a language that we can use to have those debates with the public? Feels like a really pressing issue.
Absolutely. And I think the national interest, I hope, is one way to do that, to connect to people's ordinary sense that they want more control over their lives and improvement in their lives, and not to feel selfish for wanting that improvement, as opposed to kind of policies that are justified in terms of meeting the world's needs at large. And and I just stress at the end of the day, this is being forced upon us in some degree because of America First. So Donald Trump is pursuing a new vision of the American national interest in very open hostility to the old globalist order, and denouncing the old regime in America as having abandoned the interests of America's citizens. And he's reshaping the world order and the world economy around the needs of an America First platform. So whatever we might have thought about the national interest in 2010, 2000, 1997, whatever it is, that world is gone. And so it's not kind of an academic debate. It is an urgent debate in terms of how we carve out a new role for Britain in a world that looks completely different from the world of the last 40 years. These cycles in world politics, I think, come around, between 40 and 50 years. The last one was the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union crumbled in the early 90s. This new phase has been inaugurated, imposed upon the world through Donald Trump's realignment of world order. And we have to think afresh about what we're going to do in this order, in which the Americans they're explicitly saying that they're not going to be organizing the affairs of other countries the way they did in the past. And if they do it, it'll be very explicitly not for our benefit, but for their benefit. And so how do we decide on our own path in that way? And to do that, we need a conception of the national interest, because if we don't have one, someone will have theirs.
Okay, we also need a conception of the nation, and this perhaps offers us a chance to get onto the most contentious part of your prognosis, which is what parts of the current makeup of the United Kingdom should remain part of the United Kingdom. So how do we define what makes up our nation?
Yeah, so it's absolutely the right question, and the tough one. And my hope is that the national interest. So I think at the moment there's only a very inchoate sense of British nationhood, and that in itself is partly the result of globalism, a politics in which loyalty was offered to essentially corporate ideas like equality, diversity, inclusion. And those ideas, they might be okay to run a university campus. I'm not sure they're even good really to run a university campus. And they might fit, kind of a global multinational that has many subsidiaries in different jurisdictions and needs to kind of cohere a large, workforce that's distributed, and build a brand loyalty that has a large market. But it is no basis, that kind of, those empty kind of liberal pieties are no basis on which to build coherence to a sovereign state or political loyalty to a sovereign state. So as a result of globalism and globalization, I think people's attachment to a sense of British nationhood is withered. And so what we're in the opportunity, and that is, I can understand that is a cause of regret for many people, for many voters. But also it offers an opportunity, because it means then that we're in also a tremendous position to remake a new British nation. And that is an open-ended process. It doesn't seem to me that, there are some things that we could definitely put in, but there are many things which will be the work of even subsequent generations to define what that British nation is, but it will not be able to cohere a political identity without a sense of its national interest. So my hope is that the national interest helps to unlock the self-reinforcing virtuous cycle in which it clarifies who the nation is and what the nation wants, and that further clarifies what the interests of that nation are, which reinforces that sense of national identity. So we need a new British nation. And that means it has to be built around that political vision. I hope the national interest forces us all to think about what we share in common. Living on this island, off close to Europe in the North Atlantic, we all share the same territory, the same language, many different customs as a result of a de facto open borders policy, as a result of the economics of globalization, many different cultures. But are also governed by the same set of laws and common political authority. And so that means we now need to define a new nation around that. And I hope the national interest will enable that to happen by articulating, like I say, helping us to rediscover what is in our collective interest as a people, sharing the same territory under the same political authority.
So nations are quite abstract in some ways because they've formed over such a long period of time, and there are, if you look at different nations around the world, there are some really weird little idiosyncrasies about enclaves here and there, or territory, or that island belongs to that country, despite being closer to the former. I have some. I'll let you. I'll let you sort of challenge this, but my interpretation of the current state of the world is very much, well, these are the nations that we have because of history, because of things that have happened and wars and treaties and such. We can't keep going with a period of conquest and trading, bits of land for other bits and selling out people that live there. So we have to sort of say, right, this is the current formation of the country, of the nation. And we work from that place. So, for example, the Chagos Islands, I was very much against the deal that where the government handed it over to Mauritius. I would be very much against something like that happening with the Falkland Islands, unless, of course, the people of the Falkland Islands wanted to become part of Argentina. And in the same way with the Chagosians, if they wanted to be part of Mauritius and Mauritius allowed them to go and live there, I'd be much happier about it. So Is there a risk here when because you can answer about what you think about these things, but is there a risk that if we put all of those things, like if we put territory up to the test of the national interest, we could be selling out people that live there?
So I think the national pursuit of the politics of national interest might well mean territorial realignment in different parts of the world. And I don't think there's any template to impose upon that process. It's a process that will be determined by the people on the ground, the factors at the time, the overall balance of forces, the balance of power in the world, whatever it may be. But I don't think that any politics, if we are looking to carve out a new path, and that also means accepting the fact that it might mean changes of borders and territorial realignment, a politics of the national interest couldn't freeze the map as it is at the moment and expect it to be fixed for all time, or even for the next 50 years or so. But obviously any kind of territorial realignment or revision of borders would definitely have to meet that question. How far does it serve the national interest? So I know, Seb, we've had this, we've talked about this before. I can't see that Britain's national interest is served by the terms of the Chagos deal that the Labour government has undertaken, because it is based on paying an extraordinary amount of money to Mauritius. But at the same time, I can't see the benefit of retaining all of these scattered island territories around the world's oceans, which we're incapable of defending.
Yeah.
That's the brute truth of it. If we're to be serious about defending British nationhood and defending British interests, then we have to be clear about our ability to do so. We can't overcommit or stretch our capacity to territory that we can't defend, because to do so would be to make British sovereignty itself meaningless. So I can't see that there is an argument for a real argument for retaining the Chagos Islands, given the fact that they're coveted by, well, they've effectively been occupied by Diego Garcia's American base. And I read the politics of the Mauritius deal quite differently to the way in which it's been presented in the press. It's been presented in the press as this kind of expiation of colonial guilt by a cabal of international lawyers. And I think there's something to that. Certainly that's what motivates them. But I think underlying it, really, it's being driven by loyalty to America. Because for the Americans, they want to keep the base on Diego Garcia. And to do that, they need to keep it legitimate and above board in a context in which they're struggling to retain their legitimacy with African states. They're competing with China for the loyalty of African states. And in that context, it's very important for America to have a clear-cut territorial claim to its bases and not to have any of its bases undermined on the claims that it might be still kind of part of some European colonial empire. So in that context, it makes a lot of sense for the Americans to claim to have a fully legally kind of watertight basis for their claim to Diego Garcia. And the British state has provided that by paying Mauritius off. So what is understood, I think, mistakenly characterized as a payment to Mauritius is in fact a bung to keep the Americans happy so they don't have to pay Mauritius off. So it seems to me like a complete mess. We're paying basically for islands that we can't meaningfully defend, that are effectively already occupied by the Americans, in order to keep the Americans happy, but we're paying Mauritius off for the privilege of that. So in my view, we should have just walked away. It would have been in the national interest for us to simply walk away. I understand that's controversial, and that people will feel that the views of Chagosians are important, and I would certainly agree that they are. If Chagosians are British, they've got the rights of British citizenship, and they're entitled to claim loyalty from the British state, and I think they are. And similarly with the Falklanders. At the same time, it doesn't seem to me that they have any kind of veto over the larger claims of the British nation either. So if it's in the interest of the British nation to walk away from Chagos, then it doesn't seem to me that the Chagosians get to veto that decision by British government. Certainly their rights need to be protected, and they're entitled to oppose it and to criticize, of course. But it doesn't seem to me that simply by virtue of being from that place, that they get a veto any more than any other minority in a democracy is granted a veto. So now I just want to stress, I understand that, like my view on Chagos is not widely held, but I just want to stress that whatever we talk about Chagos, it would have to be conducted on the grounds that it's in the national interest. And that doesn't seem to me to be, nobody has really made the claim for keeping Chagos in the national interest. I've heard arguments about, what about the Chagosians? I've heard arguments about, China will take Chagos if we don't keep hold of it. I've heard arguments about the rights of Mauritius. I've heard arguments about keeping the Americans happy. I've not heard anyone say that it is in Britain's national interest to keep hold of a remote island territory that Britain is incapable of militarily defending. And I don't think it's in Britain's national interest to claim territory that it cannot defend, because that's simply to make a mockery of the British nation itself.
I think the thing that's perhaps common to what you're both saying is that what isn't the right way to do things is by a kind of secretive stitch up behind closed doors with a supranational organisation, and this needs a proper public debate, and to do that is another way that we have this argument about making sure that we do reframe arguments in the national interest.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I don't want to get too bogged down in this because I feel
Conscious
like
of time as well,
we
Sebastian.
could be going for hours.
Oh, of course,
We really could. We'll have to do it over a beer sometime. I wanted to just reference one other thing from your book that you said. I make the case that reconstructing national interest as a lodestar of national politics, is a necessary step to reviving mass democratic politics at the national level, the only level at which it counts. This is itself a political determination, which means it will ultimately be decided in the public sphere and is not something that can be resolved in purely theoretical terms or proved in the manner of a scientific hypothesis.
Yeah.
Now, this really resonated with me because I wouldn't class myself as an academic. I didn't go to university, and I do worry that sometimes our political dialogue can be kept too much in the academic realm. And I think in this sentence, you're showing that it has to be done in the public sphere. We have to be having this conversation. So my question would be, how do we ensure that this test, this national interest test, is subjected, or sorry, the current political parties and the current politicians are subjected to this national interest test?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think so I think, there is a tendency, I think, people who might kind of, you mentioned, people who think that where the government is pursuing policies that are objectively crazy, they might think that there is some set of policies somewhere that would be stamped with the national interest, kind of, and they've been overlooked or forgotten, or, somebody kind of has an unencrypted USB stick somewhere in the bottom of a drawer somewhere, which has the national interest in. All you need to do is plug it into the system and you can kind of reboot it, and it will, it's just kind of been, we've forgotten it or overlooked it, or it's kind of, we've just not been paying attention to it. And I want to suggest it goes much deeper than that, because it's not a set of policies, that have been overlooked or forgotten. It's rather a way of doing politics. So it's a way. So I think people's intuition is to imagine that there is some smart person somewhere, a senior civil servant, or some up and coming politician on the back benches, or somebody who knows what the national interest is, and they don't. They really don't. I mean, that much, I think you can see from any debate in Parliament, from all sorts of mishaps by the civil service and whatnot. They don't know what the national interest is. And the reason they don't is because it isn't the way we do politics. And so it's not a thing. The national interest isn't a thing or just one set of policies fixed for all time. It's a way of doing politics. So to ask, how we, that test is that people need to feel confident, voters need to feel confident in pushing their demands on their representatives, and saying, what are you doing in the national interest? This is what I want. And voters should say, this is what I want. If they want other people to join them, they need to make the pitch, this is in the national interest. And so it's a collective, collaborative endeavor. And then they need to put it on politicians. This is in our national interest. What are you doing to defend it? So that would be my my kind of political advice to anyone who's interested in pursuing it. It's got to be something which it's not something which is lying out there to be discovered by smart people. It's something which requires citizens to impose their priorities on the public, on the state machinery, on elected representatives, and to say, what are you doing to defend the national interest?
Stop waiting for politicians to get it right and start taking on the responsibility ourselves. I think we fully agree with that.
We agree with that, definitely.
I want to grab something. Give me a second.
Should have had your prop ready, really.
I should have. I thought of this before, and then it slipped my mind. But I'm sure you've seen this before. But the SDP's new declaration, written in 2018, I think, and on the front it says the common good in the national interest.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So at least one party's thinking about these things.
Yes, I was, and I must, that is certainly something that drew my eye to the SDP when I became aware of it as a revived party back in the early Brexit days.
Great, good. So I am going to move us on now because I am very conscious of time. So SDP members, please look out in your newsletter on Saturday, which is tomorrow as we're recording.
The most recent newsletter, because this will go out after that.
Okay,
yeah.
The most recent newsletter for your discount code to order Philip's book. And Philip, do you want to mention your podcast as well if people want to
Yeah,
have a listen
so
to that?
the book is out at the end of July, as Hilary mentions. And I also am a co-host on a podcast, Bunkercast, as well, which talks about the political times that we're confronting at the moment. And you can find it quite easily if you just at Bunkercast, on Google, it'll come up very quick.
Great, thank you. And I really enjoy it. It's one of the ones on my list of must-hear podcasts. And I know, Philip, you've got something, but I'm going to maybe ask Sebastian to open on Culture Club this week.
I did something cultural.
You did something
cultural. I did
cultural.
a couple of cultural things this week.
Go on.
And I have this thing where if I ever do anything cultural now with friends, during the event, they say to me, "Oh no, you're only doing this for Culture Club, aren't you? just so that you've got something." On Tuesday, we saw each other, didn't we, Philip? And beforehand, this is in London, so beforehand I went round Buckingham Palace.
Did you?
Yeah.
Wow.
So a friend had tickets, and I thought it was wonderful. I had a really great time. So Buckingham Palace, and I didn't know much about the history of the building. So it was bought in the late 18th century by George III, and it was Buckingham House at that point. And obviously London was a very different place. I always think London's amazing because it's very unique as a city in the way that it's grown with many different centres.
It's unique. You can't be very unique.
Yeah, I know.
You're unique or you're not.
I was an English teacher as well. Unique is an ungradable adjective. So it's grown up in these different centres. Obviously, you've got the City of London, you've got the City of Westminster, and so now I think the sort of the tourist hub of London is around Westminster certainly, and Buckingham Palace, the Houses of Parliament, and you've got a lot of things to see there. So it was bought by George III. It was then renovated by George IV.
Okay, what year are we in now?
This is early 1800s.
Okay.
And I think the architect was John Nash, I want to say, who did a lot of the work that's still visible. And then it was Queen Victoria who actually added the bit at the front. So it used to be a U-shaped building. With that now we've got that quadrangle that you can see. That used to be open and exposed, and then Queen Victoria added the front facade. But the tour was great, and I was really surprised because I don't enjoy these formal touristy things, especially tours, because I'm a bit of a contrarian and I don't want to go along with the group. And yet it was great because you had a little audio player, and you could decide on the things you wanted to listen to whilst you're walking around, and you could decide on how long you wanted to spend in each room, which was amazing. And so we spent longer in the rooms that we really enjoyed. And there was some wonderful art. Now, I'm not a massive fan of modern art. I'm not sure if you are.
No, I'm more traditionalist.
And of course, the royal family have some good art.
Yes.
So there were some Canalettos, Vermeers, there's some Rembrandts. Wonderful piece of art. And the staircase, and whilst you're listening to this thing, they say this is where visiting dignitaries will enter the palace and then walk through the staircase. I think it's the best staircase I've seen in my life.
Wow.
And I love staircases. This was just absolutely gorgeous, the architecture of it, because it had a central theme. So you sort of walk up the staircase and you've got this gallery going around to the other sides. But then it almost turns into a bit of a tunnel. So it's guiding you up towards the East Gallery. I was blown away by it. And I have to say that I would consider myself a monarchist, but not a royalist, in the sense that I really don't care about the royal family. I'm not somebody that likes watching all the royal weddings and reading up on the gossip and things. But I did really enjoy looking around the palace, and I thought there was some magnificent rooms. And I'm glad it's open for people to go and look around.
So, recommendation to visit Buckingham Palace. Have you been, Philip?
Buckingham Palace, yeah.
I haven't actually, no. So, because, it sounds odd because obviously it was opened, I think, in the last 20 years or so. But I grew up with it being closed, it was something which wasn't open to the public until, like I say, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was after Diana's death, I think, some years after that it was opened up to the public. And so it was just something which, when we did family kind of excursions, Buckingham Palace kind of never figured. So I kind of missed my I missed the opportunity, I guess, as earlier in life. But obviously, I know that the royal family has a tremendous art collection. That is in itself a good reason to, I think, to visit Buckingham Palace. I mean, generally, I'm not really a palace guy when it comes, and I also share your skepticism, Seb, about the guided tours. I always kind of find it annoying to be talked at, by like some person just telling you this, that, blah, So, but I mean, it's interesting to hear you enjoyed it so much, and I think I'll put it on the list of things to do in London because I've done quite a few, and that is actually one thing I've not done.
So I'll tell you about my favourite room briefly. So the 1844 room, I think it's called, which is where Privy Council meetings are held.
Okay.
Now, the Privy Council is the oldest legislative body in the world, I believe. It was set up in the 11th century when England was ruled by an absolute monarchy. So the king had ultimate power. And he asked for some advisors so that they could advise him on, and he didn't have to spend all his time thinking about these issues. And the Privy Council still exists, of course. And in I think quite famously, when Queen Victoria was on the throne, she changed the meetings so that they were held standing up because she was fed up with how long they were taking.
Okay.
And it forced people to kind of get on with it and say what they wanted.
Maybe we need to do that on the podcast.
It would stop me blubbering on, wouldn't it?
Did you have something else? You'd have to do it quickly.
No, that was it.
No. Okay, great. Okay. Philip, you had a Culture Club item as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to something which I kind of enjoyed very much recently. So it's a 2021 movie called The Green Knight, which stars Dev Patel, and it's directed by an American director, I believe, David Lowery. So it came out 2021, but I missed it when it first came out. I only watched it recently, and it's called The Green Knight. It's based
Is that Knight with a K or Knight?
Yeah, Knight with a K, yeah.
Okay.
Because it's Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's the old Arthurian legend from the 1400s. And it is just, I mean, I'm something of a movie buff, but it's just a tremendous movie. It is so strange and odd, and the thing that's most fascinating about it is the way it takes this very ancient tale, with its origins in Roman Britain, and makes it through this kind of very striking cinematography, through tremendous kind of visuals and colors, and modern acting. It kind of makes it meaningful and makes it a new myth for the current day. And I just thought it was a tremendous accomplishment because it's something which I think is very difficult to pull off, to make an ancient myth seem strange and full of wonder and mystery in the current times, without just being kind of some crappy historical drama. And it pulls it off tremendously. So I was really taken with it. I was amazed. I enjoyed it so much. So if anyone is looking for modern renderings of Arthurian myth, I'd recommend The Green Knight from 2021.
Great, that's good. We always like it when we have a film recommendation because we're so poor at watching films that we never bring any. So great, thank you for that.
I think that's because you are steeped in high culture of art galleries and theatre shows and ballets and things, and I'm just not cultural at all.
When you say high culture, I don't think musicals count as high culture. No, I don't think so.
And was it Bearded Theory?
Bearded Theory Festival, yes, yeah.
That's high culture to me.
Great, well, thank you both. And thank you for joining us, Philip. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a great discussion.
I look forward to continuing the discussion at some point, Philip.
Definitely.
And a reminder that STP members, you can get a discount on Philip's book, The National Interest Politics After Globalization, by looking at your newsletter.
Great. Thanks for listening, everybody. As always, please do like, subscribe, and recommend us to your friends. See you next time.